This is Mike Baker, and whether Joe Rogan knows it or not, he is Joe Rogan's CIA handler. Basically, what his job most likely entails is to come on to the Joe Rogan experience and explain the CIA spin on whatever the current contemporary news might be. And in this clip, he's trying to put distance between the idea that the CIA is involved in the Epstein blackmail ring.
I know there's a lot of talk about, did he have some sort of intel connection, right?
Right.
From my perspective, it's complete speculation, but
And the rationale that he gives is that the CIA doesn't do blackmail.
the blackmail is never really ever on the table as an option.
That's more of a Russian thing, that the CIA doesn't do it.
And
So-
which services
And I
are
would,
those?
well, again, the Russians are primary users of something like that. They don't, because they've got a shotgun
Israelis?
approach. The agency, again, people are going to say that's bullshit. The agency tries, the blackmail is never really ever on the table.
This is demonstrably not true. The reason why we know this is because of a little project called Operation Midnight Climax. So, what is that? Operation Midnight Climax was a sub-project of MK Ultra, the CIA's infamous mind control project. And MK Ultra's stated goal was to find a truth serum or some kind of chemical or drug that could hypothetically get someone to spill their secrets and share information, or hypothetically control their actions against their will. The CIA tested every drug they could get their hands on, but at least according to the official story, nothing really worked. That is until they stumbled on an idea that combined drugs, hookers, and surveillance equipment. And surprisingly, it worked pretty well. And given the context that I said at the beginning, you can probably see the implications of this. I think that MK Ultra is pretty important to understand if you want to get a grasp of how blackmail and sex was used to compromise people as well as get information out of them. And I think that this project in particular, Operation Midnight Climax, gets looked over. But understanding it, it gives us a pretty insightful window into the origins and the systemization of sexual blackmail operations that show up later in history among people like Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell, or people like Craig Spence in the 1980s. And don't get me wrong, obviously blackmail has always been used in espionage, and it's always been some component of politics. However, and I'm not omniscient, maybe you know more than I do about this, but it does appear that Operation Midnight Climax is the first instance where sex and drugs and blackmail are combined in this systematized and coordinated program that was utilized by the intelligence agencies. And it seems like this particular program served as a prototype, as a blueprint for what we see in the future. And as I said earlier, the implications for this are very, very, very obvious. But before we talk about that, it's probably a good idea to have a basic understanding of MK Ultra. So, MK Ultra was a project that began in 1953, and it was born from the CIA's desire to gain control of a person's mind and actions, brainwashing, mind control, and truth serum. And the project was led by a man named Sidney Gottlieb, who was a Jewish chemist with a PhD in biochemistry, who would later take the fall for much of this MK Ultra stuff when it got exposed. So this whole project was really exacerbated by Cold War paranoia. During this time, there were videos that came out of US POWs, prisoners of war, who were on camera renouncing the United States and denouncing capitalism and all sorts of things. And I don't mean this lightly, I really don't. But due to the borderline fascistic tendencies of Cold War military-industrial complex US imperialism, I don't mean that lightly, but due to that tendency, the idea was that there is no way that an American could be made to say such things about their own country. So they had to have been brainwashed or something, when in reality it's really easy to get somebody to do that, just torture them, which is what happened. They were just tortured and deprived of sleep and food and all sorts of stuff. And you can get them to say whatever. But because of that, The Americans thought that the Soviets and the Chinese had gained the ability to brainwash and reprogram people's minds. And the thought was that if they gained the ability to do this, then America needed to as well. And it became sort of a one-sided arms race to control the human psyche, which brings us to MK Ultra. So now when you think of MK Ultra, the project is very notorious for having used LSD, but that was just one component of it. Under MK Ultra, the government experimented with all sorts of drugs, including mescaline and psilocybin and heroin and weed and all that kind of stuff. And they tried all sorts of things, like even combining those drugs or also sensory deprivation or sleep deprivation in order to see if they can gain control of somebody's mind. They tried all sorts of stuff. Under earlier projects that preceded MK Ultra, something like Project Bluebird, Bluebird being the idea of getting somebody to sing like a bird, they had already discovered that certain drugs, particularly weed, had the ability to get people to just open up and confess things openly. It loosened their tongues. However, the subject who was experimented on, who had taken the marijuana, hypothetically, they knew that they were under the influence of something, and they were aware of the fact that they had confessed all this information. So the CIA, their desire was to find some kind of truth serum or some kind of way to control a person's mind that would get them to confess all this information without actually being aware that they had confessed anything in the first place, which also extended to the idea of what if we can find some way to manipulate a person's actions as well without them knowing that they were forced to do something against their will, something that they otherwise would not have done. And many of the people throughout the 50s who were involved in MK Ultra projects had no idea. And these experiments took place everywhere, on college campuses, on soldiers, or even at CIA office events or retreats or whatever. And this continued for a while. The CIA continued to give unwitting people LSD, but all of this had to change when it came to the tragic death of a man named Frank Olson. So in 1953, Frank Olson was a CIA biochemist who worked on biological weapons, and he was secretly dosed with LSD on a retreat with his colleagues. Sidney Gottlieb, the leader of the whole project, had spiked all the drinks, and most of the men at the retreat ended up being okay, but for Frank Olson, it had really, really dramatic and drastic consequences. He spiraled into an extreme paranoia, going through what might be said to be sort of a psychotic break. And a week later, in the middle of the night, he went through a closed window on the 13th floor of a hotel room in New York City. And in the words of one of the CIA officials who knew him, he said that Frank Olson had either jumped or fell to his death. The official story was that he had committed suicide, but Olson's family never accepted that. Also because jumped or fell is a really big difference. But his family never accepted that, and that's something they contested later on. But whether or not Frank Olson was murdered by the CIA, his death was the direct result of their negligence. And Frank Olson's death ended up changing the trajectory of that program. This man was now dead because of the CIA's foolish experimentation on unwitting people. So afterward, the CIA was told by sort of the higher-ups that they needed to stop experimenting on regular unwitting civilians. And that's what they did. Officially, they really didn't stop. All that they did was shifted it. So instead of ending the experiments, and instead of, testing LSD and all sorts of other drugs on regular people, they decided to just start testing on people for whom they knew would not complain about being drugged. People who would be least likely to run to the police and report any sort of abuse. And that's how we get to Operation Midnight Climax, where they would use prostitutes to lure test subjects. In 1954, Sidney Gottlieb picked a man named George Hunter White to lead this new subproject. Prior to working for the CIA, George Hunter White had worked for the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, and he ran undercover operations, and he really looked the part. George White was a big, tough, kind of a rough guy, and according to him, there really wasn't much that separated him from the people that he locked up. For example, to give sort of an idea of the kind of man that George Hunter White was, Here is a direct quote from a letter that he sent to Sidney Gottlieb, reminiscing about his time that he worked on Operation Midnight Climax, saying, quote, "I was a very minor missionary, actually a heretic, but I toiled wholeheartedly in the vineyards because it was fun, fun, fun. Where else could a red-blooded American boy lie, kill, cheat, steal, rape, and pillage, with the sanction and blessing of the All-Highest?" Yikes. George Hunter White was just a rough guy, and he was denied entrance into the Federal Bureau of Narcotics 3 times because White's, quote, "personality, approach, and appearance were not up to Bureau standards." And on his second entrance exam, it was said by all of his interviewers that George Hunter White displayed, quote, "all of the hallmarks of a sadist." White was a rough guy, but Sidney Gottlieb chose him to run the project. And this brings us back to Operation Midnight Climax. Operation Midnight Climax wasn't some weird offshoot of MKUltra in the same way that something like Operation Acoustic Kitty, where they implanted like listening devices in cats. It's not that kind of tangential relation. Midnight Climax seemed to be the true fulfillment of the aims of MKUltra, because this appeared to be the first instance, at least on paper, where it appeared that mind control and truth serum were successful. So what really was it, right? So the CIA set up safe houses, first in New York and then in San Francisco, where prostitutes on the agency's payroll were told to bring Johns, right, the clients or whatever, to the safe house. And once inside, the men were secretly dosed with LSD, and they were recorded by, hidden cameras and listening devices. The apartment was set up to look very inviting and welcoming. And what would happen is the men, the Johns, would come to the apartment and have sex with the prostitutes. And, most of the time, the men would have to be either kicked out or the prostitute would leave or whatever. But George Hunter White trained these women to stick around with the guy and say like, "Wow, you're really swell. I just want to hang out with you and you're great." And the prostitutes were trained by George White in order to figure out how to ask the right questions to get information out of the men. And it would be really awkward and super uncomfortable. And combined with the awkwardness of having to hang out with a woman that you don't know, and also the post-nut clarity, they would just talk about their job and what they do for work and all sorts of things and disclose information that they otherwise wouldn't, because they think that they're just talking to a woman that they're never going to see again. And this aspect of MKUltra was really, really successful. George White even struck a deal with the local San Francisco Police Department that if one of the prostitutes got picked up, the girls could be let go if they explain that they're one of, quote, George's girls. Now, as it pertains to the surveillance aspect of it, as of this point, I might have given the impression that it was a very scientific and kind of clinical sort of experimentation, but it was way closer to like a frat house, honestly. Because what what it really looked like, there was a one-way mirror where the CIA agents would just sit in there and they would just drink all day and watch hookers have sex with these men. And this apartment safe house, it wasn't the only CIA brothel that was run. George Hunter White had run at least 2 other CIA brothels in the Bay Area. And both of these operations were basically the exact same thing with the one-way mirrors and the recording devices and all sorts of stuff. But by 1956, the cover at this particular spot was blown when one of White's associates used it as a front for a narcotics bust, and the location was just burned, so the CIA had to go to another location. And that too was eventually burned as well. And after all that, Operation Midnight Climax continued basically for a decade, officially, when it was finally shut down around the time when LSD was made illegal in the United States, which officially, sorry, I'm saying that a lot, but marked the end of the CIA's experimentation on LSD. So, what was the point of all that? What did they ultimately discover? Well, as I said earlier, I view Midnight Climax as the true fulfillment of MKUltra, because through this experiment, through the combination of sex and surveillance and blackmail and post-nut clarity and drugs, they found that they could get pretty reliable information from people who were compromised in a position where they can't talk about it. It's not mind control in a true sense, but functionally, you get the exact same results. Operation Midnight Climax proved that you really don't need a truth serum, just so long as you have the right combination of intoxication and cameras and embarrassment, you can get similar results. And this combination created a toolkit for intelligence whose implication from then on till now and the legacy of this systemization of this project lasts till today. So what am I talking about, right? So the combination of prostitutes and listening devices and intoxication, you see something like that in Craig Spence. I don't know if you're familiar with the Franklin scandal, but a man named Craig Spence was tangentially related to that. And he was said to have listening devices and recording equipment in every single room of his home. This was in the 1980s. And Craig Spence was very powerful and influential in Washington. And it was reported by the Washington Post that he was so influential that he took some of his young male prostitutes on a late night tour of the White House. That's how powerful he was. And this man had connections in Washington, had connections with the Bush family, and he recorded people while they were doing things in his home during parties and all sorts of stuff. Very clearly the same stuff that they did during Project Midnight Climax, which is very clearly used for intelligence gathering and blackmail and espionage. And then you end up seeing the same thing with Jeffrey Epstein, a man who had all sorts of connections too. He had connections with the Clintons. He had connections with Trump. Every single room in his house was wired. There was recording equipment and everything. And he had blackmail and all sorts of figures. Which brings us back to what I was talking about at the beginning. Mike Baker is a liar. The CIA did blackmail. And if they did blackmail back then, and if figures like Craig Spence or Jeffrey Epstein had high-level connections as well, it's foolish to think that the CIA would not do blackmail now. So this is why this project matters, right? So Midnight Climax matters, not because it invented sex, blackmail, or whatever. No, it didn't. Because it's the first documented instance when it systematized the use of drugs, sex, and recording devices, and this was utilized by intelligence communities, and it actually worked. And as I said, they didn't find a perfect truth serum, but they found something that was just as effective. So if you found all this interesting and you want to know more about Epstein, I did a podcast with a friend of mine where we go over the basic outline of Epstein's life and some of his intelligence connections. If you want to see that, that's linked here. Or if you want to know more about the international prostitution rings, you might like my video about John Wayne Gacy, which discusses that. But with that, I really appreciate you taking the time to watch this. So thank you so much for watching, and God bless.